So hello everybody, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're dialing in from. Thanks for joining us today for this exciting webinar on connecting pollinator corridors. Today we are going to learn a little bit on how to deliver a nature-positive grid, looking at the example of pollinators. And I'm very excited to be hosting this webinar today. Our webinar is a part of the Connecting Energy series of the Renewables Grid Initiative, and we are currently co-hosting this with RGI and GINGR together. So the civil society webinar series aims at hearing the voices of experts, and we want to train civil society with some sort of knowledge which is required for a renewables-based and nature-positive and just energy transition. So welcome everybody. Before we start, I want to share quickly a few housekeeping rules for everyone. So my name is Annika Liljestam. I am based here in Berlin at RGI, and I am moderating today. I'm the coordinator of GINGR within RGI. I would ask you to have your camera on when you speak, and especially during the Q&A session later. But please have your microphone off. It would be great if you could rename yourself to your name and your organization so we know who's joining, and also so when we talk later that we have the possibility to quickly understand where you're from. We have a longer Q&A session planned at the end. So if you have questions, please, you can already drop them in the box. My colleague Adrián Maté from our comms team will help with the chat today. If there are urgent questions after each presentation, of course, for clarification issues, we are also happy to answer these directly after the presentation. But for the longer one, we would like to keep these for the Q&A session. And you've probably already noticed this session is being recorded, so we can also share it with other interested people who could not join today. Just very quickly, for those of you who don't know us yet, who is RGI? We are basically a European-based NGO. We are engaging sort of as a link between transmission system operators, TSOs, and NGOs. And we want to promote a fair and transparent sustainable grid development and foreseeing growth in renewables in the long run to achieve full decarbonization. And as I said, we're co-hosting today with GINGR, the Global Initiative for Nature Grids and Renewables. So RGI and IUCN have come together to put GINGR into life. And we want to support a just and sustainable energy transition as well, and currently focusing mainly on offshore wind and on grids. And we are working on providing assessment tools to quantify contributions to nature and people-positive goals. But you will learn a little bit more about this later from my colleague Adrián Maté, who's also joining from GINGR. And if you're interested, please have a look at our webpage to learn a little bit more where GINGR is currently facing. Now I'd like to introduce our great speakers here today. A warm welcome, especially to Kimberly, who got up early this morning on the East Coast of the US. Thanks, Kimberly, for joining. So Kimberly is joining from the Rutgers University. She is a associate professor at the Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Natural Resources. And basically, Kimberly will tell us a bit about what science tells us about bee corridors. She will focus on the ecology aspect here today of the theme today, and will tell us why corridor vegetation actually matters. Then we have Kendall Jefferys on the call. She's joining us from the UK. She's a postdoctoral research associate at the University of Oxford. And Kendall will help us to understand a little bit better how to map and monitor corridors, even from space, actually. And she will explain how to monitor pollinator-relevant habitats. So there will be a deep dive into remote sensing. Then we have Tiina Seppänen from Finland. She joins us from somewhere in the middle of Finland today, actually, from the field. She's from Fingrid, and she will explain to us how a TSO is actually doing all this work in practice and how TSOs can work with landowners. And we will then hopefully understand a little bit better how these efforts look like on the ground. And finally, last but not least, we have my colleague Adrián here today with us, who will close this session by integrating all of the aspects mentioned into a unified system and how GINGR actually can turn all of this into a nature and people positive metrics. So as I said, we have a long list of presentations coming up. We will start with Kim. Everyone has 15 minutes. I will look at the time, and then we are happy to have a longer Q&A session at the end of this session. So I will then stop sharing my screen and will ask Kim to share hers. And I will give you the word to you because we're already 2 minutes late.
All right, so can everyone see my slides?
Yes.
Yes. All right. Wonderful. Well, I'm excited to speak with you today about this topic. I've spent about 20 years researching the potential ways to make use of power line corridors to support wild bee populations. So my goal for today is just to give you kind of a brief overview of the research that I've been conducting over this time period, and then give you some suggestions about how you might go about measuring the success of some of these actionable items that I will think of would be useful to implement in rights of way, and how you might measure, whether you've been successful. So one bit of clarification, and just that there may be a little bit of different terminology in terms of between the US and Europe. When I say wild bees, I use that title because in the US, European honeybees are not native and they're domesticated. And my research is really focused on the needs of bee species that are native to North America. So obviously there are other pollinating groups, but I always say that bees are the workhorses of the pollinator community. And so that's really what I am working on. So most of you should be or already aware that bees are facing some problems in terms of their conservation and their populations due to a variety of different threats, which I won't go into now, but my research really focuses on ways to support pollinator populations by providing food, both in terms of abundance, but also in terms of temporal stability, and also thinking about where bee species are able to make their home, so nest site availability. And so these are areas that can be addressed and reasonably well in power line corridors, and so that's been the focus of my research. Mostly I'm going to be talking about this paper that came out a few years ago in 2018, where I worked with a power company in Maryland, specifically to examine the differences between vegetation management in the power lines, and how that influences wild bee populations. And what we compared were control corridors, which were under the standard management regime of repeated mowing, either every year or every 2 years, which is pretty standard practice in the state of Maryland. But then comparing that to integrated vegetation management practices that had been implemented in some new sites in Maryland as a bit of a trial to see what impacts that might have in terms of wildlife, and then comparing that again to sites that have been managed through integrated vegetation management for a long period of time. And so the way it works in the United States is that if a power line corridor goes through a nature reserve, the company needs to coordinate with researchers to minimize impact. And so there's a set of power line corridors going through a nature reserve in Maryland called the Patuxent Wildlife Research Center, where they've been having to use this management technique for going on 40 to 50 years. And so we had a nice set of data points that were across which we can compare. Integrated vegetation management, I'm assuming people know what that is, but if not, it just means that you are selectively targeting tall growing species, usually with specific herbicide, and then leaving the rest of the vegetation to grow up. And what we've learned in these old sites managed through integrated vegetation management is that they get to a stable state quite quickly where they naturally repel tall growing species. And that actually reduces long-term costs in terms of management. So it's a great situation. So our research, as you can see, that we conducted bee surveys in all of these sites. We found there were significantly more species and individuals in those sites that are managed with IVM. And then if you look a little deeper, because again, a rich and diverse bee community is going to be better at providing pollination services, both in the landscape generally, and so not just in the right of way, but in the surrounding areas. So you want measures that will show you that you have a diverse and robust bee community. So we found that in the IVM sites, we had multiple trophic levels, which means we have parasitic bee species, we have social bee species, and we have specialist bee species that are specialized on particular groups of plants. And all of the rare species that came up in our surveys were found in the IVM sites, the old sites. We also had more stem and wood nesters in the old sites. And we also had a higher abundance of small bee species. And what is the relevance there? Well, the relevance there is that bees don't tend to move far from their nesting sites. And so if you are doing a survey, and we use passive collecting techniques, you don't know whether a bee is coming into that area, just flying into forage, or whether they're living and residing there. But since small bees fly shorter distances than large bees, if you collect many small bees in a particular habitat, you know they are local. They are living and foraging in that site. So that is another measure of a quality of that habitat type. And so again, our results were pretty clear that IVM is a good method to employ if you want to promote healthy bee populations. Now, nesting site is something that most people don't think about, especially if you're used to focusing on honeybees that live in hives that are usually provided by those who are managing them. But wild bees, they build their own nests. And it is as important to provide places for them to nest as it is to provide food for them to eat. And as they don't fly far from their nest, typically, with the exception of a few species like bumblebees and certain other large bodies, you need to think about, providing the kind of habitat that they can make home. And so I put this data up here. We did these quadrat surveys in these different areas, the control sites, the newer IVM and the old IVM. And what stood out is, as you can see circled here, is the percent dead woody vegetation, percent litter, and percent bare ground. These all correlated with certain groups of bees that require those attributes to build their nest sites. So again, it's something that's important to consider when thinking about creating useful bee habitat. And certainly that management technique is doing just exactly that. And we saw that come up in the distribution of different groups. So to conclude, transmission line easements or power line corridors can provide valuable habitat for wild bees. We kind of knew that going in. Bees like sun. You need to keep vegetation low under the lines. So there's already an overlap there. But you can do better, right, by tweaking the management style, right? Vegetation management does matter. IVM is superior to mowing. It creates a robust and diverse bee community. So I also wanted to know, though, how do rights of way compare with other open areas in the landscape? Why are they particularly valuable, or are they particularly valuable? And the research that I did, where I sampled on and off the right of way and similar comparable habitats, is that at the least, rights of way are equivalent to isolated patches of open habitat in a landscape, for example, restored prairie or other parks. But in fact, in many cases, they actually had higher abundance of bees because they have long paths of connected vegetation, and they are maintained in that state over long periods. Many open habitats, if left to their own, will grow up into forests, at least in North America. And so the corridors provide connectivity and consistency. And then I talk about, and people sort of joke about, I have a colleague that always says, save a bee, kill a tree, because bees like sun. However, there's a lot of research to suggest that the ideal habitat combo is having a forest edge nearby with an open habitat nearby. So having both near each other is useful. And at least in North America, a lot of the power line corridors are bordered on one or both sides by trees. And so that combo is particularly useful. After that study, we wanted to know whether we could do more than just manage through IVM. And so I instigated a project with researchers here and the power company PSE&G to think about, well, what if we, in addition to just managing the vegetation there, what if we add in a seeding component, right, which is one, broadcast seeds of pollinator bee-friendly vegetation, or what if we go even further and really try to get rid of invasive species that don't provide resources for native bees, and then maybe even supplement with plug or tree planting, at least in isolated patches along the corridor. High intensity, but you can get high value. And so we came up with a seed mix. I won't get into the details there. Obviously, that's going to depend on where you are, what's going to grow. And we really we've collected all the data. I haven't analyzed it yet. I'll show you some preliminary information. So we had IVM sites, we had IVM Plus, which is the sites where we were seeding, and we collected 14,000 bees, and we're right in the middle of analyzing that result. Some preliminary results, and just draw your attention, is that if you see in the pie charts, the IVM Plus has the most even distribution of colors, meaning that they've got the highest diversity of species that we see in the other sites. So we're still mostly working at the genus level, but you can see that this additional level of management is going to yield potentially greater results. Now, the question is it cost effective? And that's another part of the study that we haven't finished analyzing. We also did some trials of, as I mentioned, of a more intensive, in a situation where you might have community organizers that can help out, or a university where you have undergraduates. You can do something more, where you can take stretches of corridor and you can actually put in shrubs or plugs to enhance what's there. So you're basically building on the seed bank by adding additional species. So we did a couple studies with that. It's a little bit tricky knowing what plugs to choose, and just briefly going over our thought process, right? We wanted plants that provided resources for bees, plants that wouldn't be killed by the herbicide that we're using to get rid of the invasives that are not beneficial to bees. And then we needed plugs available at the local native nursery. And of course, in North America, we also need to make sure that they're not going to be decimated by deer. And so that's a concern here anyway. And so we came up with a list, and we installed those plugs. As I mentioned here, one of the most invasive species that causes problems is something called mugwort. And so, in other sites, instead of doing the sort of a broadcast plug distribution, we treated for this invasive species, and then we saw what was already growing there that were in terms of plant species beneficial to bees, and then we just enhanced them with some selected plugs. So instead of doing a whole corridor, we just sort of said, okay, we already know that this species can grow in this area. Let's just add more of that species once we get rid of the mugwort, and replace it with this high quality shrubs and plugs. So we've done that, and early data shows that removing this invasive is going to result in increasing bee abundance and bee richness. And so again, we're still working through that, but that's another option of an intervention that you can make. I'm just checking the time here. All right, a couple minutes.
Yeah, you have a couple minutes. That's fine. So I gave you less time in the beginning.
So again, my general conclusions is that, controlled succession, which is essentially IVM, can create valuable habitat for native bees. And in that case, you're just modifying what is already there. You're just getting rid of the tall growing species. You're focusing on the perennials and the shrubs. You could also go another level where you can seed, right? So broadcast seeding usually requires some prep. It's a little bit more intensive, and it can be expensive. We found that, plugs are better than seeding. You get more return per individual, but it's more expensive. So you can build on what is already there. Controlling invasives is really important, but not always easy. You kind of have to pick your battles. It's probably the same in Europe. Some invasives really are not going to be a problem, or exclude high value plants, or provide resources themselves. Many bees are generalists, so it's not always bad to have an invasive in your corridor, but some of them are quite nasty and will outcompete everything else. So you just need to learn what to focus focus on. And then obviously you need to consider nesting site diversity, right? You want to make sure you leave litter, you leave dead stems, that there is some open ground as well. And so those are kind of some of the take homes of, what will increase the value of these corridors for pollinator populations. How do you go about measuring? So I'm a scientist, so I go and I do these intensive surveys, but most people don't have access to that kind of specialized knowledge and ability. So it's great if you can, but if you can't, there's a couple things you can do. You can measure indirectly by doing quadrat surveys to estimate nest site diversity. And so you're just putting down quadrats, you're measuring for these factors that I've determined are important, and then you can see if you've made progress, if your corridor is increasing in value through your intervention. Normally in these corridors, you already have floral assessments on the regular. You've got contractors that are doing vegetation surveys. You can use those to estimate food resources for wild bees. We have something here called the Floristic Quality Assessment. Sorry, I'm just going to stop my timer. I'm almost done. So you can do something like that, create a metric based on vegetation, and that's going to be dependent on local bees, obviously, and local plants, but you can do that and use that as a surrogate for increasing habitat for bees. If you have the ability to do some direct measurements, again, you have people, volunteers that can do this. You can trap using bowl traps for wild bees. You can use netting for wild bees, and then you get an actual snapshot of diversity and richness in your corridor. But if you don't have the time to do species level ID, you can do floral observations, and it just looks like that picture. You sit and you watch the flower patches, and you get a snapshot of the diversity of size and color of bees. And so I've had some students that have done that and shown that you can get a pretty good idea of how well you're doing in terms of creating habitat for bees by doing some floral observations, which is accessible. All right, thanks everyone for your time. This is just my acknowledgement slide. There's too many to thank, a lot of pictures of people that have helped me with this research over the last 20 years. So sorry I went so fast. Happy to answer questions at the Q&A at the end.
Thanks, Kim. That was great. This is a rush through, but it was really interesting. And congratulations on this work, actually. Really great. So we learned that this actually works in the real world setting, and that transmission lines can actually help the bees. So that's great. So I would like to give the word to Kendall now. So we learned a little bit more about how remote sensing and field data can be combined to monitor pollinator habitat. So yes, please. Oh, it's gone again. You have to click it again, I think.
There we are.
Thank you.
Is it working? Great. So hi, I'm Kendall. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Leverhulme Centre for Nature Recovery, which is sort of within the University of Oxford. So Kim gave us this really nice overview of sort of the ecology and the vegetation management on the ground. And now I'm going to talk about how remote sensing can really scale up these approaches to monitor pollinators and pollinator habitat at larger scales. And so thinking about, why kind of explore these applications of remote sensing to pollinator ecology. And the context is just there's been this proliferation of satellite and Earth observation tools in recent decades. So this is the European Space Agency, all of our Sentinel satellites. We also have NASA and all of Landsat and JEDI satellites that are very commonly used in ecological studies. And this is not including all of the other forms of remote sensing that we have at different scales. And so this increasing availability of data really raises the question of how do we integrate this data with field observations? And also how do we use remote sensing to advance biodiversity science and monitoring? And so one way that remote sensing can be really useful in ecology is we can start to detect individuals. So we can count elephants from space or seabird colonies from drones. But pollinators are much more difficult to detect. They're operating at much finer scales. And I see this as a gap, given that we know pollinators are really, really critical for ecosystem functions as well as food production. And so having these more efficient ways to monitor them would be really useful. So thinking about, how do we apply this to electricity corridors or power lines, and, what can we actually measure with remote sensing? I've kind of listed here these increasingly scalable approaches, from trying to detect pollinator individuals themselves with remote sensing technologies, all the way to characterizing the structure and the variation in the vegetation at a wider landscape scale. And all of these approaches kind of have the common goal of mind of can we find these more scalable metrics that we can use to measure the benefits of different management techniques, like Kim just talked about the integrated vegetation management. Can we actually detect those differences from remote sensing and develop indicators that can indicate the benefits of these different types of management within corridors for pollinators? So first thinking about, can we detect pollinators with remote sensing directly? There's been a lot of interest in work into the use of camera traps and ecoacoustics. Now, I think for pollinators, we're really not sure how accurately we can detect and really identify the species of pollinators that are in an area based on the photos as well as the sound. And this type of technology is often trained or processed using AI algorithms. So you need these really, really large libraries, reference libraries, to actually train these. And I think for a lot of insect pollinators, it's understudied, and we don't always have that reference library to actually train it and process all this data. So I think this is a promising future direction, but personally, I think for pollinators, we're not quite there with using these more on-the-ground technologies. So rather than detecting pollinators themselves, what I really work on, and what other remote sensing approaches are doing, is looking at these ecologically relevant vegetation characteristics, such as flora resources, and whether we can use these as proxies for pollinators or pollinator habitat. So this is just an example of from drone imagery, you can quantify the flower cover. And this study that was doing it here finds that the flower cover is a really good predictor or proxy for the bee abundance and diversity. And on the left here, this is just another study. They're mapping the density of willow trees in an area, because willow trees provide this really good source of pollen and nectar in springtime for mining bees. And they were looking at the relationship between the density of these trees and the size of these mining bee nests. So again, just examples of we can actually start to map and quantify the availability of resources for pollinators at a landscape scale with these remote sensing technologies. So if we think about applying this within electricity corridors or power lines, we can now much more efficiently kind of look across broad landscapes where these power lines are, and try to quantify the resource availability for pollinators. Thinking also about nesting habitat, which is super important. There's been less on the remote sensing of nesting habitat, but there has been some work looking, you can remote sense bare ground, for example, and combine this with data on the slope to get this sort of indicator of nesting habitat suitability. This is just another example of a study. They were looking at mining bees as well. But I think this will be a really interesting area for sort of future work. Now, kind of zooming out and thinking beyond, mapping specific resources with remote sensing, we can also think about trying to map and quantify habitat suitability for pollinators more broadly. And so one way to do this is this sort of species-centered modeling approach, where we take the raw spectral bands from the satellite imagery to train these species distribution models. And so we learn the species habitat based on the remote sensing imagery that's sort of unclassified. So the other way that this is often done is you would give it a land cover classification for it to learn what the species habitat is, so say a forest or an open area. But the idea here with using the spectral bands is that species may use and perceive landscapes differently from the way that we do. And so we can actually start to learn, just based on the satellite imagery itself, what types of habitat these species occupy, and these more fine scale differences in the vegetation, particularly that I think pollinators would respond to. But there's been work done with this with birds as well. So I've actually done this application for hummingbirds, which are also pollinators. And this is the rufous hummingbird in North America, which is a migratory hummingbird. Its population has declined a lot in recent decades. And so we really wanted to map these trends in habitat, and we were able to do this given the continuity of satellite imagery. We could train it to learn the species habitat, and then sort of backcast these predictions over the past few decades to start to look at trends in the habitat suitability across the entire breeding range for this species. And what we found is this positive relationship between areas where there was a positive habitat suitability, so actually increases in suitability, and forest disturbance. So we see this link between actually disturbed forest and what makes suitable habitat for this hummingbird, which makes sense if you think about they need floral resources, right? Even though they're probably nesting in trees with sort of overhanging branches. So this importance of kind of a variation of and variety of habitats comes up a lot in this work. If we think about applications to power lines, this is just an example from Norway. They were using, again, these species habitat models to kind of estimate or predict the impact of different energy infrastructures, the transmission lines, distribution lines on the habitat quality for different species and the effects of fragmentation. So taking this kind of remote sensing-based approach, we can look at how habitat suitability changes with the implementation of linear infrastructures, how it might change with different management approaches. We can also think when developing new infrastructure, how to minimize the impact to the habitat for specific pollinator species that we might be concerned about their conservation. Now kind of thinking less about these more species-focused approaches. A lot of my work is really focused on whether we can use remote sensing to detect the diversity of resources that might be available in a landscape for pollinators. So this is a lot of my PhD work that I did in Brazil. So we were working across the savannas of the Cerrado in Brazil, but I think the ideas here do apply a lot more broadly and could be scaled to different landscapes. So if we think about the resources that are available in a more open habitat versus in a more forested habitat where you have, your canopy floral resources or your cavities for above ground or cavity nesting bees. And then if we think about the diversity of resources provided by this variation in the vegetation types and vegetation structure, we can actually measure that diversity of vegetation through remote sensing indicators, whether we're quantifying vegetation in the structure from LiDAR, which captures the 3D vegetation structure. We can also measure the variation in spectral reflectance, which can tell us about the different plants that are on the ground. So this is what we were doing sort of across this vegetation gradient. And this just shows you what it looks like in the field. We sort of sampled these 50 by 50 meter plots. And on my back, on that backpack is a LiDAR scanner. So we're using terrestrial LiDAR actually in this study. And then within that plot, sampling both through kind of passive sampling and also active collection of what pollinators are interacting with the plants to form these plant pollinator networks. And so here we really wanted to link this fine-scale remote sensing data with the ecological data to explore whether, you could use one to predict the other. And this just shows you kind of what this LiDAR data looks like, particularly the terrestrial LiDAR is really, really fine scale. And you can't see here, but even in the understory, we could really detect the structure with the different grasses and the shrub layer as well, which is going to be really important for the movement and habitat for pollinators. And so this just shows some kind of initial results from this work. And perhaps unsurprisingly, we find that this fine level structural characteristics, particularly the complexity or the structure of the understory, was the strongest predictor of the structure of these plant-pollinator interaction networks, which makes sense if we think about pollinators are moving in and out of the understory as they're foraging. And so the structure of the understory and how complex it is actually going to influence both kind of their movement and their interactions with plants, as well as the sort of resources available to them. And also thinking, so, we sample across this vegetation gradient, and what I want to highlight here, and sort of Kim has already touched on this, but in these plots really close to the forest, we found a lot of eusocial bees. So significantly more eusocial bees. In the tropics, these are a lot of stingless bees, but also honeybees are eusocial, compared to our more open grassland plots where we found mostly solitary bees. And what this shows is that the eusocial bees, which are often nesting in these tree cavities, are not foraging very far from their nesting sites. And also when you look at these intermediate vegetation types, so these areas in the middle here, they're supporting a diversity of bee functional groups. So kind of when you have this diversity of different resource or habitat types, you have different kind of functional groups of bees with different nesting habitat requirements. So if we think about creating habitats within corridors, I think it really emphasizes the need for, different vegetation types within the corridors, but then to also think about the edges and what is surrounding these corridors, and are we still maintaining natural habitat in trees to kind of provide complementary resources for pollinators. now thinking about really scaling this up and looking for more common indicators. We're expanding this work into some other areas. So we're working in Ghana as well. And we have across this sort of nature recovery landscape, a lot of remote sensing data from drones. So we have the LiDAR, the structure. We also have the spectral imagery. And we're going to link this to pollinator surveys on the ground to see if we can use the remote sensing data to actually detect and predict the changes in pollinator diversity or the plant-pollinator interaction networks at the ground level. So just kind of showing the gradient that we're sampling across here from more preserved forest to agroforestry areas to more agricultural sites. And again, just thinking about, the different resources pollinators need. Often we're surveying flowers, but then this is just showing a honeybee colony nesting in this hollow of a large mango tree. And also there's an amazing diversity of butterflies found in these more forested plots. And building on these ideas, we also find a lot of carpenter bees in and around the areas with the forest preserves. And so thinking about how these structural metrics might be really good indicators for effects of landscape change on this group of bees, and how indicators that kind of capture the variation in the structure of the vegetation in the landscape may be associated with bee diversity. And these are things that we're still exploring. So kind of zooming up and to conclude, thinking about how can remote sensing help deliver these more nature positive grids, and why does this matter to TSOs? I think TSOs have the potential to support diverse pollinator communities when we think about enhancing habitat connectivity in the areas covered by corridors, and also if they can provide the heterogeneity of resources that pollinators need. And remote sensing really allows us to see different aspects of the landscape that we couldn't capture before. And this can facilitate the development of indicators for biodiversity that can feed into biodiversity credits or these kinds of schemes that I think TSOs are well placed to benefit from. And I think TSOs are also really well placed to facilitate collaborations between scientists, civil society, local communities, so that we can sort of work together and try and create and restore habitat, and then also monitor that habitat for pollinators across sort of energy grids and these linear infrastructures. So that's all from me. Feel free to reach out if anyone wants to discuss these ideas further, and I'll pass on to our next speaker.
Thanks, Kendall. This was very lively and colorful. Thank
Lots
you
of
for
visuals.
these nice impressions now that we're all in the mood to go to Brazil.
Yeah.
Really
you.
pretty. And yeah, also congrats on your great work. So we will have Tiina joining from Finland. My colleague Adrián will share the slides because Tiina has some connection issues. And now we are going to learn a little bit how this can work in real life from the viewpoint of a TSO. So without further ado, I would give the word to you, Tiina.
Thank you. Do you hear me now well?
Yes, we do.
Nice. So now we go to the science to practice, and I will tell something about the landowners and TSOs working together on pollinators.
Before you begin, Adrián, can I have you click the swap displays button at the top of your screen there?
Yes.
Thank you so much. Perfect.
No,
Take it away, Tiina.
Now there is some kind of a zoom.
This is not the slide as it's supposed to look. No.
No,
I think
but you can have the next one.
Okay.
Okay.
Now it looks good.
Okay. So just a few words about Fingrid. So Fingrid is Finland's transmission operating system operator. Next, please. And about the numbers, I just pick up one, and that's the 14,700 kilometers of transmission lines. So there should be some space for the pollinators also. Next, please. Some words about the landowners' rights. The main challenge that we have is that transmission line areas are not owned by Fingrid. In expropriation, Fingrid obtains a restricted right of use, which is needed for building and maintaining the transmission line. The landowner still owns the land and is deciding how to use the property. And Fingrid offers information how to use the transmission lines for the nature or for the people. And we have made these idea cards for the landowners. You can see them here. Unfortunately, we have those only in Finnish and Swedish, so I picked up some titles about what kind of ideas is there. And for the pollinators, you can notice that there's grazing, which is good for the pollinators. And also the wetlands, number 3, and number 4, save the pollinators. And city gardens also. And also the traditional landscape. And we also deliver guidance for the land use planners for the cities and municipalities and tell them how to use the right-of-ways and how not to use the right-of-ways. So there is some security issues also involved. Next, please. I picked out one card just to tell that what kind of ideas or how do we build these cards. So there is a lot of tips and ideas, practical ones, how to implement for example, the right-of-ways for the pollinators. For example, where to locate beehives, not to use the pesticides. How can you help the wild pollinators by creating nesting and overwintering sites for them? And maintaining a continuous supply of flowers. And then you can have some seeds for flowers, which are important for the pollinators. Also, there is some text about how the pollination is an ecosystem service. Next, please. And we are creating open areas when we are cutting the trees and doing the vegetation clearing of the corridor. So we are doing or making these traditional landscapes for the corridors of the power lines. Next, please. And we have noticed that because of the rural biotopes and the cultural habitats are there is a lot of threatened species on there. So we are offering financial support for the maintenance of traditional biotopes for the landowners. And we have been doing this for several years, but we haven't got many of these sites. Landowners haven't been very active on this, but we have some. And nowadays we are also doing some vegetation survey on the EIA projects, so environmental impact assessment, when we are planning new power lines. So we are trying to find the potential biotopes so we could kind of inform and market this support for the landowners. So we could find more of these sites where the landowners can get the support for the maintenance of these habitats. Next one, please. And about this support, it's 600 euros per hectare and it's for 3 years. And there is some conditions for granting the support. There has to be some kind of values like species or scenic value or something like that, but it's very easy to make these applications for the support. So we don't want to make it like hard work for the landowners. And the applications can be submitted year round. Next one. So we have also some other biodiversity actions. For example, collaboration with the Uusimaa district of the Finnish Association for Nature Conservation. So we have made the 3-year agreement that they will take care of some traditional biotopes under the power lines. And we are also looking for more sites to work with them. And this is kind of the same that we have the support for the management of these traditional biotopes for the landowners, but now the active part is this Nature Conservation Association. So they are doing the work and we are paying for them, and the landowner gives the permission. And then we have had some sheep on the Luoto Island for over 10 years. We have a cooperation with the landowner, which in this case is the church. And we also pay for the owner of the lambs that they will bring them on the springtime and then take them away. And we are paying them some summer work money for the sheep. So this has been a really nice project and long term one. And the next one, we have an ongoing study about the impact of shortening the clearing cycle. And this has just started. We have found the potential places where the try this and pilot. And last summer, we had this vegetation survey on those areas. And then we will continue that way, that normally we do the clearing every 5th year on these areas. But now we are shortening it to 3 years. And we will be checking out how it works. So does it work for these traditional landscapes, which are also very important for the pollinators? And the last one of these biodiversity actions are insect hotels. So on summer 21, we were installing more than 60 insect hotels on the basis of the towers in the Kouvola region. And we have been checking these hotels every summer. That is their visitors. There is a lot of visitors. They are very occupied on summertime. And also we have been checking out how these nests or the hotels are taking all the weather conditions and do they need some repairing or something. But it has been going well. And this is something that could be done a bit on a larger scale also. Thank you. That was all from me.
Thank you, Tiina. Very impressive. So we've come from the east coast of the US. We've been in Canada, we've been in Brazil, and now we've been in Finland. So very interesting and great that Fingrid is going forward with this. So maybe I can already see some connections here on some work, maybe with Kendall and Kimberly that you could follow up. So now I would give the word to Adrián. Are you
Hi everyone. Can you see the screen properly?
No.
No? Okay. Let's see if I can do this swap thing.
Appeared again. So Adrián, we will learn a little bit on how we can turn IBM and pollinator work into robust metrics for nature positive grid. And we will see how this fits in the GINGR framework. You can also take your time. We have some extra time, so
yeah, just let me move through the slides.
I cannot see them. Oh yeah, now we can.
Okay. Is it working now?
Maybe you have to press that slideshow button again.
Okay.
It could be the same error that
It
Kendall was
worked
having.
well with Tiina's slides.
All good.
All good.
Sorry everyone for this technical issue. I don't see the button right now, but I'll try it now again.
Is that okay?
Yeah, it's trying to. I'm working on it. Sorry, everyone. Yeah, I'm trying to put the slides on. For some reason, it's kind of not flowing. Hope it works now. Is it working now, Eston?
Yeah, we see the presentation, but when you press this button, it disappears again. And it's the same error that Kendall had.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I found like if you go and you press like share the slides, and then if you go back to the Zoom and you have to share again and you click on where the slides, yeah,
Yeah.
there we go.
Okay.
There we go.
There we go.
All right, thank you. I was getting a bit nervous, but now
All
it
good.
works.
Take a deep
So thank
breath,
you.
please. And
Thank you, Kendall, for that little tip. So basically, what Kim has shown us before is that we can use IVM as a technique to bring life back to the corridor. Then what I think Kendall also suggests is that we can also measure those benefits very clearly, not only from remote sensing, but also with practical work. And then Tiina connects these to the science with the landowners and turning these ideas into real practices, which means that we can do through the right management and through the use of science and people, we can align corridors that can truly become nature positive or support nature, basically. So this is basically what we are developing in GINGR. GINGR, which is a joint initiative by IUCN and RGI, we are developing this framework that is going to work for offshore, but also for onshore. And in the case of power lines, we believe that first, we have seen that power grids can be measured, we can measure those, and we have seen through the work from Kim, throughout the field testing, and through the remote sensing, the study of the flood resources, that we can actually integrate this in a practical way, and to quantify this into a method that we can therefore use for not only TSOs but also for regulators and for the industry overall to turn standard corridors such as the one we are seeing in the left picture, where we have the power lines in Spain in purple, and the green areas, the Nature 2000 areas, so we can turn these corridors into landscape or ecological connectors, which is a potential opportunity for us in the sector, in the grid sector, to make IVM into a solution that is also measurable and it can be also comparable and can be audited and therefore can bring biodiversity gain. Why do we need to do these things? Basically, it's because more and more TSOs are being asked by regulators, by their shareholders, by their investors, how do they report nature and people, and how this is being done is basically answered by three questions. Can you actually measure using simple qualitative or quantitative metrics and show how IVM can actually improve biodiversity and human enjoyment? So the answer is yes, and we will see that in the next slide. The second question is, can these metrics show real gains? Are we offering more habitat, more pollinators? And the second answer is again is yes. And the third one is, can these TSOs use simple values, single unitary values, but for each right of way to expand their knowledge in other areas rather than just the reporting, such as the life cycle, the LCOE or the life cycle assessment. And those are, again, the same answers, which is yes, we can. So this is an example of a survey which was done by another expert in pollinators. Her name is Megan Garfinkel, and she took around a survey on 65 surveys around homeowners living next to these corridors, and she was basically asking what they thought about living next to a IVM fostered corridor. So corridors managed with more flowers and natural vegetation, like prairie or old field styles, were seen as more attractive. People really liked them more, and residents didn't mind living next to those. So the improved habitat through IVM, it didn't create social conflict. In fact, it helped TSOs to develop faster grids. And this is really important because it's one of the things that we we are seeing as TSOs are having a lot of struggle to deliver quicker or faster grids. So in short, basically what we're saying here is that a better biodiversity can also mean better human experiences. Then the second question which was, can these metrics show real gains, more habitats, more species, more pollinators? Is yes, it can be done. The complexity comes here that with so many number of metrics, but at GINGR we are coming up with a set of core metrics that we can actually translate this complex ecology into very simple and comparable single number of indicators. For instance, we can say one metric tell us how much biodiversity has been lost compared to a natural baseline, and the second metric would tell us how much how abundant native species are still present in that location. With these two numbers, theoretically, TSOs can describe what's happening along a corridor, not just with thousands of data points, but only with a few or one simple comparable value. So this dream of translating complex ecology into simple comparable single indicators can be done. Excuse me. And then the next thing is, and the third question, which was, can TSOs use simple value, can use one of the simple metrics also to report to the CSRD, to the EFRAG, to the TNFD requirements? And the answer again is yes. We know that we can measure nature. The next step is that we can use these metrics for more than just reporting. We can build indicators that are grid tailored or tailored to grids that can actually reflect what nature and people, how people and nature are affected. And we can combine these metrics with the service that Kim and Kendall have been doing to create stronger baseline studies, which also is connected to the Fingrid's idea with the EIAs. So basically, by understanding how much nature is in there, how people are affected and use the land, then we can design how a corridor can fit better into the landscape. And this is extremely important also for life cycle impact assessments, where so basically the message is that these metrics are not just for like ticking more boxes under a reporting document, but to help to understand how can we design grids a bit better and improve them. And this is what the GINGR Framework is trying to put together with our group members. We do so with different members in the group, where we have presence from Europe, also from international TSOs and so on, and NGOs. And we call it this co-authoring process, and I like to call it the fact of delivering a culture of integration, where first scientists and NGOs and local communities and TSOs work together to put like all this data into some sort of strong baseline that then can be used to measure these impacts on people and nature. And then with these baselines once ready, we can then design these nature and people positive grid corridors that can, as I said before, can improve the habitat, support connectivity, and also create real local benefits to the communities that are living next to these corridors. And of course, this is also really important for, as I said before, to the investors, and it's also and since they are eager to understand how can they keep on financing or insuring these infrastructures, and how can we make them confident that these designs are also delivering long-term benefits. And I think this is my last slide. This is like this. Yeah, it's a summary of what we presented this year. It's in this. This is called an update from the Linear Infrastructure Technical Working Group. It's in our website, and this is the end of our journey for this first year. From IVM to remote sensing, from metrics to actions and from local corridors to this global framework that we are delivering. So thank you, everyone, for being here today. And now I think we can move into the Q&A. Annika.
Yeah, great. Gracias, Adrián. So this is well on time. Unbelievable. So we have enough time for discussion, and I hope there are many questions. In case you have a question, it would be great. You can raise your hand. I saw there are some discussions already ongoing in the chat. There was one clarification question. What is meant by litter? I think, Kim, you already answered this. It means leaf litter. Of course, no rubbish, no plastic litter. Plant detritus. Did I pronounce this correct? And then we want to go into the discussion. You can also raise your hand and then please turn your camera on so that we can see you. And also, again, the reminder, if you are speaking, would be great if you could also tell us which institution you're joining from. I would like to ask a very first question, so to open the discussion. So I saw, especially in Kim's and Kendall's presentation, that you also mentioned community involvement at some point, and I would like to understand how we can ensure that benefits for pollinators also translate into benefits for local communities, be it farmers in Finland or landowners in Finland or indigenous communities in Brazil, or I don't know, whoever lives in Canada or in the US, but how can we make sure that these are involved? And Kim, I also saw in one of your slides, you had people on the ground underneath the transmission lines. Are they from the communities? Were they from your university? Like, how can you involve the communities into this? Maybe you want to start, Kim.
Sure. Yeah. So I think you're absolutely right. I think, what I've learned since I started this work is that getting the community involved is really important to pushing some of these initiatives forward, and also providing some of the labor may be necessary. In Maryland, one of the new IVM sites was actually pushed forward by a community organization. Again, people that live near the right of way were alarmed by the episodic, I think they did an herbicide treatment and just sort of, as they say, nuked it. And the community was really upset by that. And they sort of mobilized, because there were a lot of communities nearby, and sort of put pressure on the power company to be like, can you do something else here? Because we want to use this to walk our dogs. We want to have, like maybe a park system here. And, that was sort of before I started my study, but like that kind of was the impetus to sort of get that going. And then since I've been doing this work, I definitely, I've seen that in some rights of way, they'll have community gardens under that. That's a way to have people be invested in it. And people often will say to me, like, what can we do? Like community organizations like green teams and, other organizations that are interested in conservation, they see my work like, oh, well, how can we help? And it's sort of more making the connections with the people at the power company and, they almost need a liaison, to sort of bring them together so that, they can sort of maybe, in certain areas, it's usually dependent on the locality, but if the right of way goes in an area where there is an organization, then they could be the ones to put in the plugs, to put in as long as they have permission. I mean, one point that I didn't mention that was brought up by Annika is that most of the land under the lines is not owned by the company, and so anything work that's done has to be approved by the owner of that land, and so there is some of that, but I think there's ways kind of around that in terms of getting their cooperation. In most cases, they do give it. But sorry, this is a rambling answer, but I do think like involving the local community, making those connections between the power company or the management company and the local groups would be a great way to sort of expand some of these more intensive management practices, like putting in plugs, putting in seeds, because some of those people you saw were for Rutgers. Like Rutgers has a day of service where, the undergrads, everyone sort of participates in some community efforts in the local area. making use of that and other organizations, I think, is a way to kind of like defray some of the cost, but also to involve the community so they're invested, and also to kind of, make that, as we know, a lot of people are really anti-corridors. I mean, they kind of, people will protest and there is a negativity associated with this. And then, but turning that into a positive and making good relationships, I think will make everybody happier. The power companies will be happier, they'll have less opposition, better able to do their jobs, and then the people living near them will be happier because, hey, they've got this nice meadow, instead of this, monolith of invasive species or, brambles. So sorry, that was a very long, rambly answer to your question, but
No, great. That's great. I'd love to hear also maybe from Kendall, when you did your PhD in Brazil, how that was perceived.
Yeah, so in Brazil, I don't work specifically under power lines or in that context, but if you think about, getting the permission to go and sample, I mean, in Brazil it's a bit different working within a national park. But the park was really like so that was native vegetation, but we were completely surrounded by agriculture within that park. So if we think about, and working with local people there, like the question is always kind of like, what are the benefits if we conserve pollinators here to sort of the agricultural areas? And also the work we're doing now in Ghana, we sort of have the ecological team with the remote sensing and the biodiversity components, but then we also have a social science team. And so we are working together with the social science team who has really established these connections with the local communities and the farmers, where we're doing a lot of the sampling. And so we can communicate to the farmers and get permission to sample on these lands. And then we can also explain, we're looking at pollinators, they're important for crops. And kind of thinking about the social science team is looking also at the food security impacts of this different nature recovery or restoration schemes. And we think about agroforestry. And from the pollinator side, they kind of found from when you have a lot of the cocoa forest, it reduces food security. Whereas when you have kind of mixed farming systems, you have greater food security, you have different crops. And we also find more pollinator diversity where you have all these different crops. And so there is a clear link between, managing landscapes for pollinators and benefits to people, particularly if you think about food systems. So not an energy example, but just thinking, pollinators do have kind of clear benefits to people. And I think it's important to kind of explain what you're doing and especially the communities you're working in and why they're important.
Yeah, great. No, I mean, this is also why we took this example of the pollinators, because it's an easy to catch example, right? So maybe we can then connect to Tiina, because there was a question for you in the chat from Melinda. And Melinda, step in if you want to add, but you ask, so Tiina, you said landowners haven't been very proactive, but how do you promote your idea cards? How are they informed that they have this opportunity? So how do you go to the landowners? How do you connect?
We have been telling about these cards on the newspapers sometime, but it hasn't been enough, I guess. And also when we are meeting the landowners on the public meetings, when we have the EIA process going on, like tonight, we are meeting a lot of landowners. So we are telling there how to use the right-of-ways. But now we have seen that it's maybe not enough. So we are also trying to find these potential areas when we are doing the vegetation surveys for the EIA. So if we find potential areas there, we are contacting the landowners and trying to market this support for the traditional landscapes.
Okay, thanks. Melinda, is this answering your question? Or maybe there's a way you both can also connect after this call to exchange views on this. There is a longer question from someone from France. It's Frédéric Rivert. Maybe you want to ask your question directly, because it seems to be there's already some exchange with Kim, but maybe it's a very long question. You might want to explain. Are you still on the call?
Yes, I'm here. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, I think Kimberly gave me some answer about what we are going to experiment in southwest of France. So it's in a conifer forest landscape, and we want to compare different management methods on the power line and test what is the best for bee species. And so we're doing if everybody try moving with or without exploitation of vegetation. Our hypothesis is with exploitation of vegetation, we can think there is more plant diversity, and so, but that in hypothesis we have to test. So just to see if some people try this kind of comparison of management methods in similar context. I mean, with coniferous forest around.
Yeah, and as I mentioned, the most comparable would be the work I've done in Oregon, which is the Pacific Northwest, probably more similar. But the truth of the matter is, and this is the thing that gets a little bit frustrating, is sometimes the best management technique is going to be region specific. And so it's not always, you know what I mean? Things aren't always transferable. What happened in Oregon is that the corridor going through the coniferous forest was mowed like with a big device, like we call bush hogging, right? Which grinds everything up about every 5 years. They would just, and it was pretty brutal. And I think in that landscape, once they did that and removed the veg, everything dried out and it got dead dry. And it took a long time for the vegetation to get back, to grow back in the rights of way after they'd been mowed in that way. And so whereas the sites that were either mowed annually or because they were just going tall grasses, or they were managed, like I mentioned, with putting in these shrubs. So speaking of a community, the corridor in Oregon where they had installed and cultivated native shrubs, the manpower actually came from prison people in minimum security prisons were brought up to do the plantings, which is kind of crazy, really. But I guess they got outside. But in that scenario, it was more microclimate was maintained better in the habitat where it was planted. It didn't dry out. But that might not be true in southern France. Like I don't, so I feel like doing region specific studies is important because there's only so much that is applicable, on a broader scale. And so I think, it's definitely, I can't say I can't predict necessarily what you'll find. And so I think it's very useful to investigate and just sort of see kind of what happens, and then that can be used as a metric in your area. So I don't know. I mean, leaving some of the vegetation can be useful because it creates habitat. A lot of the cavity nesting bees like the dead litter, the dead woody. But it depends on what group you're trying to, that's not going to do anything for butterflies. Butterflies like the grass. Butterflies, are not so big on that. So.
Okay, thank you.
Kendall, do you want to add anything, or you seem?
No, I mean, I agree. And I was kind of thinking as well, it's like, with remote sensing, we try and kind of think, how can we scale this? But I completely agree that we need to know kind of what is the ecology on the ground before we try and do that. And because I think things will differ between regions, and I work a lot in tropical regions, and it's kind of like, well, is this going to be different in temperate regions? Probably. And so I think we need a lot of like kind of that ground truthing really before we try and make these more generalizable claims.
Okay. Then I saw a comment, it's more a comment from Alana Gallo from WSP Canada. I don't know if you want to speak up. It seems you seem a bit skeptical. She says, I love the idea of species-specific models. However, I could only see this really being applicable at the genus level for bees. Do you want to specify this?
Sure. Hi.
Hi.
I'm Alana. I'm in Alberta in Canada. So
very early for you, huh?
Yeah.
Thanks for
Waking up
joining.
before 7. Yeah. Yeah. So my question was about the species-specific models. So I also do a lot of work with birds as well. So I understand how birds have very specific niches that, well, some do, that they like to occupy. But for species like bumblebee, so we have a couple of species of bumblebee that are listed federally in Canada. but these bees are generalists, other than this parasitic bees that need their hosts. So is there any, well, I guess, Kimberly, Kendall, have you seen any models of specific species of bees out there, or is it kind of just general bumblebees or solitary bees and stuff like that? Yeah.
That's a great question. And I haven't, so I use this method for a hummingbird because I think it does suit itself naturally more to birds. And I haven't seen it been applied to specific species of pollinators, but it's something I would be really interested in. Like, are there species that we can actually detect maybe more fine scale habitat that we wouldn't have been able to detect if we were kind of trying to model with these broader land cover categories? Because if we think about, bees that require dead wood for their nest, we wouldn't necessarily capture if there was a lot of dead wood in an area from a land cover map, but maybe from the satellite, it would pick that up, that signal of having a lot of kind of dead wood or a disturbed area. So I think it's definitely something to still explore with insects and with bees, because I haven't seen a lot of that work done. So I would like to do it. And I think you may be right that it may work better at this sort of genus level where you kind of have genus-specific habitat requirements. The other limitation I think with that is that you do need good occupancy data. And so if we think about pollinators, there's a lot of pollinators where we don't have that. So you would kind of have to focus on key species where it's like, okay, we know this is well surveyed, and then you could try and build those models. So it's something I'd be interested in doing, but I don't have a specific answer for you because it hasn't been done for bees, as far as I know. Yeah.
Yeah, that's okay. It's kind of what I expected, but I thought it'd be worth an ask. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. So there's another question from Melinda. Oops, now it's moving. Adrián's already answering, but maybe you want to take this here, Adrián. Are there studies measuring IVM's potential gains for farmers, pollination, etc.? And will that be included in the GINGR work?
Yeah, thank you, Melinda. If I understood correctly, what we are trying to do at GINGR is first categorizing all these impacts that power lines have: soil alteration, habitat loss, fragmentation, edge effect, noise, electromagnetic waves. Then we map these impacts into the potential metrics that we can use that are following the state pressure response framework, which is also being led by, this is the leading framework to measure impacts by other organizations such as the Nature Positive Initiative. So once we got the impacts categorized, then we are moving into how these impacts affect biotic species, and therefore we can then also connect these impacts to ecosystem services. So within ecosystem services, as you know, we have these ones called cultural ecosystem services, which there are too many, but we have managed to find through literature review that by mapping 5 of them, we can interconnect them all. So if, for instance, we are running service underneath power lines, then we can say, okay, this is the work that I showed before, like 65 surveys from different people done through different farmers, allow them to understand how they felt about IVM in power lines. So we can then follow this reasoning to understand how people feel or react to power lines by measuring, for instance, floral resource or the species, and then we can say, okay, IVM works. The people feel more relaxed about power lines. If we don't do IVM, if we just do standard vegetation management, people don't really appreciate the extra piece of work done by TSOs, and therefore there will be potentially more social opposition. So the idea is just, yes, we can map the both positive and negative impacts by this GINGR framework, in the GINGR framework. I hope that answers your question.
I think it does. So I would invite, Melinda, do you want to add anything or a follow-up question?
No, it's perfect. Thank you.
Okay, great. I mean, I invite you also to just get in touch with Adrián at a later stage, maybe. So are there any other questions from the audience? We still have some 10 minutes to go. If not, I have a follow-up final round question for all the speakers. But this is your one and only chance to talk to these people. So raise your hand if you have a question. I mean, for me, it was very insightful. So thank you all for this great webinar today. I learned that while corridors are often controversial, that we already know how to make them good for pollinators. So I think that's a really good sign. And we already have tools to measure this. So TSOs are already doing it, landowners are already doing it. So there's already some evidence on the ground. And I would have some final round question for everyone who was speaking today. So imagine all of you. Oh, Alana has her hand up. You wanna ask another question?
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I actually have one more question.
That's fine. That's fine. I'll do my final round after you.
Okay, sorry, thank you. So my question was for when we're pushing for the idea of using these corridors, so I can't think of the word right now, but these corridors and enhance them for pollinators. And I was wondering if when you're putting forth this idea, if the idea of enhancing it just for pollinators, is that enough for a lot of, I guess, stakeholders and to be like, yes, that sounds amazing, let's do that? Or do you kind of have to also bring in more of, I guess, bring in different taxa and say like, okay, it's also good for birds, or is it also good for people, or is it good for whatever else? Like, is the pollinator angle enough? Have you found? I think it's more for Kimberly maybe, but yeah, has that been enough for people to get on board with this?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's interesting you say that. I mean, I I did my graduate work in spiders, and let me say, pollinators are an easier sell than spiders, even though they're biocontrol, right? I was surprised actually at how positively people responded to the pollinator story, and as an impetus for conservation. Like when I would just run into people when I'm out surveying, when I give talks, people seem to, I don't know, people have done a pretty good job of explaining how important pollination is, and people are sort of generally concerned about the bees, I would say. That said, I always try to make a point that, this sort of early to mid-successional habitat is limited to a lot of species out there, so I tend to at least address to say, honestly, what's kind of good for these bees is also good for, mid-successional open habitat birds and small mammals. And I do tend to kind of like at least mention, because I think it is true, it's just that the link between pollinators and food is such a direct one that it's a good argument to make, whereas the wildlife generally, you would think it would be a good link, but it's sort of more abstract, I guess. So I don't know. So I mean, I do tend to bring in it because I do think it is true that this kind of habitat is actually limiting in big parts of the world, this early to mid-successional habitat, and it would benefit lots. So I talk about it. I don't know if that changes anyone's mind more so than just the pollinators, but I don't know. So that's my thought.
But there probably need to be some more studies on this, I guess, to make the connection. But sounds, yeah. Does this answer your question, Alana?
Well,
Yeah,
if I
sorry,
can
go
chip
ahead.
in a little bit, is at GINGR, what we saw is in order to pitch to investors, to shareholders, we can only talk about one single species. We have to use one structural habitat, and then at least I would say four taxon. So that is like a representative mapping of the impacts that grids have on nature, and that connects the idea of nature, people, ecosystem services, and so on. So we cannot only say we do power lines with bees, therefore that's going to be awesome. We get the green bonds facility in place, and the financing for the TSOs will be cheaper. No, you need to do bees, and at least for more other, and that will facilitate the dialogue and the understanding on how grids can become more nature integrated or people integrated in a way. Hope that answers a bit more the question.
Yeah, and this is a very great connection to my last question, actually. So that is a good overview. So imagine we all meet again in 5 years, What progress would you like to see by the end of 2030 on this? So what convinced you that corridors are on the way to becoming actually nature positive at scale? I mean, you know your current research, you know your plans with GINGR, you know what Fingrid is up to. So this would be very interesting to hear if you think about the next 5 years, what will be on your wish list? Yes, Kim.
I'll just start because I was thinking about this already. I mean, again, it links a lot of things. And someone asked this question. I would really like to see like a nice connection made between the proximity to a well-managed corridor and benefits to the agricultural land surrounding it, pollination services, to see that, to make that connection that, yeah, we can sell these as, oh, these are little pollinator habitat reserves, but really what we want to see is that their presence is benefiting the landscape. It's benefiting the farmers that are near them. It's benefiting the community in some way. So I think like that, more sort of broader scale approach and being able to say those things would be really, really useful. And I just haven't, I've tried to get some students to collect some data on it. It's not easy, but, some ground truth data. I mean, we know it in principle, but it would be great to sort of have that, the actual like broader benefits of a well-managed corridor would be huge to be able to say that.
Thank you. Who wants to go next? Tiina.
Okay. Because of the geography of Finland, a lot of transmission lines are in the forest somewhere that nobody can see them really. So I don't think there is a lot of scenic value in there. But in places where we go near the towns, cities, I would like to see the cities and town as landowners to get more active on the power line areas, because nowadays they can be like a little bit like wasteland where there's just bushes and they don't take really care of those areas. So I think they could be more managed by or we could do more together with the cities and municipalities on those areas where we are near where the people move and where they live.
Okay, yeah. To involve the communities, great.
Yes.
Okay. Kendall?
I think similarly, I would want to kind of see like at the landscape level, we're thinking also about the edges of the corridors as well, and the different types of habitats that you might get with like complementary kind of open habitat, maybe more forested or shrubby area where the vegetation is allowed to grow. So kind of thinking more holistically at the landscape level. And also it'd be nice to see, I haven't seen a lot of examples of really managing these types of electricity infrastructure in more kind of the tropical regions that I've been working in. So it'd be really nice to see this kind of expand more globally. And I could be wrong, I could be missing maybe some applications that have happened, but personally it feels like it's happening more in Europe and the US. So it would be nice to see these ideas kind of, take off in other regions where I think they could be really impactful.
Thank you. Great example. Adrián.
Yeah, I think IVM already we know all IVM. It's a great way of fostering the wildlife in power grids, and by dissecting the species that are interrelated into the IVM and studying them in 5 years' time, as we are doing now with bees, I think it would facilitate more not just the understanding of IPM as a potential beneficial technique, but also to map how can each of those species that are living within the IBM can also be connected to people and communities, to also understand how can we use local knowledge to enrich the way we think today about IBM, maybe use ecosystem-based adaptations that these communities can provide us. And I think it would be great to keep on working in these arenas.
Thank you. So now on my clock, it's 4:30. So we are on the spot. Thank you everyone for joining today. This was really nice. Thanks for everyone joining so early, so late in the evening. I wish you all a wonderful, if you celebrated Christmas time, if not, season's greetings or happy end of the year. I hope you will have a healthy new year. And please stay in touch. Keep up with RGI work, GINGR work, and any questions later, please reach out. The webinar is recorded. It will be online. We have the slides online. And thanks, everyone. It was great to be with you.